Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekachak.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to the 15th episode of By-The-Bywater. Great to have you back with us. Great to be back with you. We could say it before, we'll say it again. Before we go on, however, look, last 2 months our intros have been a little just because of the wider health crisis. This time around, look, it's big, it's massive, and if you haven't been paying attention, what the? But more seriously, there are 3 things we just want to get out of the way before we regress to our little discussion about medieval times. First off, Black Lives Matter. Duh. And if you hadn't sensed that by now, then, sorry. And especially if you've been following all 3 of us on Twitter, look, we're going to leave it at that because it's so self-evidently obvious, and you can get much better information from much better sources. Check our show notes. Beyond that, look, if you're interested in speculative literature and you haven't enjoyed the works of, let's say, Samuel Delany, Octavia Butler, N. Cave Jemisin, Marlon James, so many other people besides, you're missing out, and you really should be looking into that and much, much more. Let me also throw in a recommendation for Zeta Elliott, who's a not new, but been sort of coming up in the past few years, more attention, Canadian writer, very good as well. But there are many, many other folks out there to check out. Please do. Second, as we all know, Tolkien hated allegory, but he loved applicability. He says so right in that introduction. So please consider the applicability that when the hobbits come back after all their adventures to the Shire, the first sign that they notice something is wrong is not merely a barrier, one could even say a wall across a bridge, but the formerly low-key, not really police force, not really border patrol, the Bounders have been turned into a total bunch of militarized jerks run by a bunch of total pricks. Again, not allegory, but applicability. Just think on that for a while. For the final thought, consider so much of the militaristic preening in uniforms and like of late from various sources, people maybe even in unmarked uniforms, and I give to you a quote from Faramir. I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend. And if we're talking about protecting and serving, that's, those that pretend who are supposed to be the ones you get the good side of things, shall we say. And we need say no more because we don't have to say any more. And we'll leave it at that. Best you all, stay safe out there, do what you can do what you have to do, but do what you can do. And if either of you want to throw in on that, feel free, and otherwise we'll move on to the news.
No, just like amen corner over here.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I'm not saying Tolkien would have said a cab, but I do think it's not a coincidence that towards the end of his life he talked about how he, his political beliefs tended more towards like a sort of not anarchism, but like sort of, and it's not a coincidence that the police force in the Shire is just a few sheriffs that just kind of mostly chase after wayward livestock. It's really not, not police central here. So,
And when things transform, Sam talk about the terrible food and all the orc talk. And again, that puts it mildly, doesn't it? So, okay. So, we just wanted, having shared that out, time to move on. We do have a little bit of news, not much. So Jared, please, as always, do take it away.
In happy news, New Zealand's control of coronavirus has advanced to the point where film productions can begin again. And notably, the Avatar films are about to gear up again.
Yay!
Yay! There's been no formal word yet on Amazon's Lord of the Rings production, and various unsourced rumors are, as always, all we've got, including a claim that production may not start again until October, given the country is about to enter the winter months, because they are in, of course, the Southern Hemisphere. In the meantime, there have been some fun Tolkien-related events online involving the Peter Jackson casts. Andy Serkis did a 12-hour reading of The Hobbit to fundraise for COVID-related charities in the UK, and then joined many of his fellow cast members in an episode of Josh Gad's Reunited Apart series, along with Jackson himself, Philippa Boyens, and soundtrack composer Howard Shore. I almost said Harold Shore. I know who composed the music. Otherwise, as with so much else, things are just generally on hold.
But yeah, that Josh Gad thing. I mean, the series is what it is, and it's the framing is what is a lot of '80s fonts. But it was kind of cool to see them all. Did either of you two see that? I just caught up with it the other day.
I actually have not had the chance to watch it yet. Weirdly,
the thing about the Josh Gad one is that, again, it was indeed fun to see them all. It's interesting to see who really hasn't aged. It's like Orlando Bloom. I think is just going to look like that forever. It's like going, what the, whereas same with Elijah, but other folks are starting to look like, okay, yeah, Billy Boyd's looking a little grayer and things like that. And Peter Jackson is sort of like now over the past couple of years, suddenly now is very noticeably grayer. It's like, oh,
the Hobbit did it to him.
Yeah.
Well, remember, speaking of Avatar, he's the Weta team and all that and production thing is James
That's
Cameron
true.
Running around. He's probably going like, what?
Oh no.
Who knows? But it was a fun little get together. It was a combination of rereading famous scenes and doing them over again, just short lines and bits, and just talking about stuff. And there were some bits and details that I wasn't familiar with, like a little behind the scenes stuff along the way. But yeah, it was just kind of fun to see everyone again. A lot of good in joking, I would say, and it was all pretty good. And if you do watch it, watch all the way to the very, very end, because there's one last little bit after the credits, which is kind of fun. But yeah, I didn't see the circus's reading of The Hobbit. I should have done, because I mean, it can do the voice. I'd be interested to hear the voices he did for all the various characters. So I should catch up on that. That sounds like a really good idea for sure. Beyond that, yeah, we just have to wait and see regarding seriously, in terms of the Amazon production, nothing but rumors, no one's going on record with anything. It seems to be a big ow at this point. So we'll just have to see until they actually say something. But to be fair, I think part of them is also probably glad that, let some other productions go first and see how it goes.
Yeah.
Make sure everything's okay before we do anything. And so beyond that, though, yeah, I know, again, it's going to be a quiet time because the news is really elsewhere in the world.
As it should be.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So production can come. There's no rush. So, and no word on anything new from the Tolkien estate in terms of, publishing or putting things out. So aside from one thing I did notice briefly, I'll mention, I hadn't realized they're doing this. They're now doing, they've probably been doing this for a while. I only maybe just noticed. Print on demand, hardcover editions for the History of Middle-earth series. If you wanted a hardcover copy of any of the History of Middle-earth books, there are now 13 books, because besides the 12 books in the series, there is a 13th overall index to the entire series they've also published separately. Me being me, I may eventually get that, but I'm not in a rush. So we'll see. So that's the only other bit of things to note. So beyond that, really, I think it's just time to go on to the main topic, and it is Jared's choice this time. So Jared, once again, the floor is yours.
First of all, how do you pronounce this guy's name? Because no matter what I say, somebody is going to say that's wrong. And no, I'm not talking about the author. I'm talking about the knight. Is it Gawain? Is it Gawain? Is it, according to Wikipedia, the Welsh is Gawain? What is his name? We don't know.
Could we just call him the guy? Like
The dude, the knight.
The G-Man.
my man? Yeah.
I am going to say Gawain. I'm going to say right up front, that is how I'm going to be pronouncing it. Literally, do not at me, because I don't care. I should care, but I don't have it within me to care.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Having gotten that sort of confrontational thing out of the way, let's dive into the topic. If you haven't read this poem, let me summarize it really fast. It is a Middle English poem dated to around 1400, probably I think a little earlier. I think the manuscript, which is in the British Museum, one of the few things they didn't loot, is dated to 1400. The poem itself, I think, is like more contemporary with Chaucer. So like late 14th century. It concerns the adventures of Sir Gawain, who is one of Arthur's knights, who is challenged by a Green Knight to cut off the knight's head. And then a year later, the knight will repay him that blow, as it were. And then Gawain adventures off through the north of England to find the knight a year later, and comes to this castle where he's invited in to stay the night before he goes on his way to find the guy he's going to get killed by. in this castle ensues this bizarre, what I can only describe as like a weird fairy sex game.
Yes.
Where the lord of the castle and Gawain make this agreement where whatever the lord of the castle will go out hunting each day, and then at night he will bring Gawain whatever he catches, and at night Gawain, who's staying in the castle, will give the knight whatever he, quote, catches, unquote. So I love this poem so much. The lord of the castle goes out hunting each day, catches deer, a boar, a fox, like on each of the successive days. And then each morning, as soon as the lord of the castle leaves, the lady of the castle comes into Gawain's bedchamber and is like, hey, sup?
Let's bone down, please.
Let's mess around. And rather than boning down, as Oriana put it, the lady kisses him each day, which means that's what Gawain gets that day. At night, he has to kiss her husband. And this happens all 3 days. And I think the number of kisses goes up by 1 each day. So at the end, they're just like making out in front of everybody. And then Gawain goes off to find the Green Knight, finds out that the Green Knight is actually the lord of the castle. And this was all a test of his like honor. Yeah. And it was all set up by Morgan Le Fay, who, like, again, a twist, was there all along. She was this old lady who was just hanging out in the castle. Gawain goes home and he's all ashamed because he lied about keeping something that the wife gave him. Arthur is like, no, dude, it's fine. You know what? We'll all wear green sashes to commemorate what we learned. It's a weird little poem. Like I said, and I will keep saying, I love it so much. It's, I don't know, I hesitate to use the word cute, but it's just kind of cute. It's like, it's weird and it's kind of sweet in a weird way. I don't know. As far as I can tell, pivoting back to Tolkien for a minute, I had thought, rereading it, that it would have some bearing maybe on his work, like maybe he was influenced by it in some way. But rereading it, I don't see a whole lot of influence. I know Luke Shelton, friend of the show, Luke Shelton, pointed us to a piece where he argues that Tolkien got the word, or the name of one of the Valar from this poem, which is an interesting essay. We probably link to it in the show notes. But aside from that, the poem is really concerned with courtly love and knightly behavior and right action and who is the ideal knight and all that kind of thing. And Tolkien is more like the Kalevala, like, let's go steal a magical object and mess stuff up. And I don't know, did you guys, this is where like I just have a set of questions really, did you guys see any connection to Tolkien's larger work, or is this just like an interesting one-off translation, an anomaly in his work? What do you think?
I see it as maybe the thing that made him, that kind of pushed him away from the chivalric type of stories. Because I, you know, in one of the most well-known letters that he wrote in, you know, it's like in front of the Silmarillion, he talked about how the Arthurian tales for him were too French, you know, too obviously French. And what's interesting about it is I'm holding up this book. It's A Distant Mirror, Barbara
that's a good
Tuchman's.
book.
I just so happened to be reading it at the exact same time as you chose this topic, which is amazing because A Distant Mirror is about the 14th century and particularly France. And France and England were at war for most of it. So there's a lot of stuff in there. But there's this great explanation of chivalry and the sort of storytelling that revolved around notions of chivalry and how French they are. And it all seems so opposed. It seems as though Tolkien very consciously avoided all of these sort of tics almost. Because there's so much of this. Jared, I know you love this. I was like, and maybe it's because the world at large is on fire, and that was sort of the background. I was like, man, we got to get here a lot sooner. That was my kind of like, I was like, okay, let's move this along. But there's a lot of obsession with, you know, it is very much of its time. Everything is of its time. That's a useless platitude. But it feels like the connection is the lack of connection. Does that make sense?
No, yeah. Like the influence is almost a negative influence. Even though he liked the poem, it pushed him towards being like more, quote, English.
Yeah.
Well, I'd throw in, this is kind of my contribution on sort of like background and what to think about it here. Something that struck me, I think what's really interesting about the poem is not merely the subject itself, and of course how, you know, this is his choice of language and translation, and that's something, you know, maybe to bear in mind, we can bear down on a couple of points too. But stepping back to the introduction introduction, I note that he makes a very clear point about something, which I think probably should be maybe borne more in mind, and that is how he distinguishes very clearly the unknown, the Gawain author, from Chaucer.
Mm-hmm.
And he specifically is really he drives down hard on the distinction between London and the West Midlands,
Mm-hmm.
which in terms of larger British, or English, I should say, history properly, the distinction between London and quote unquote everywhere else, and how everywhere else is kind of the othered in comparison from a London point of view, and how from every other regional point of view, there's yourself and then there's London. To a degree, he really sort of drives that home in the in the introduction, and he combines it with the fact that because it is a very particular dialect of English that one can say is maybe not quite so French. I don't remember if he spells it out here, but maybe the idea is that it is more particularly regional. This reflects his interests in, one could say, obsessions, not merely on language, but this idea of regionalism, the fact that not everything is a seamless blend of it's all one language, dialects, branches, things like that. You get a real sense of, Tolkien the scholar in this, but also you could say Tolkien the broader thinker, one can say social thinker, perhaps, is the best way to put it. Not maybe in the way we would phrase it these days, but in thinking about how societies, differ across even seemingly short distances. That to me is kind of the thing that sort of leaves out. I'll stop for there because, Jared, you're leading the discussion, but that's kind of the thing I'd throw in terms of background. I will add one thing. I do agree on Barbara Tuckman and Distant Mirror. The Patrick Wyman podcast, Tides of History, spent past 2 years going over essentially late medieval into early Renaissance times. Whole bunch of episodes about England around this time in particular. I'll try and throw some links in the show notes, but that's good for some listening in terms of background stuff in very interesting ways.
Speaking of the dialect, so I think as Ned briefly touched on, this poet is presumed to be from literally just forgot the region, the West Midlands.
West Midlands, yes.
And it is very different from like Chaucerian Middle English, which sort of morphed into Standard English. This one is, I don't know how different it is because I'm not a Middle English scholar, and reading this, I wish I was, because I feel like I would have a lot more to say if I could be like, well,
right.
The vocabulary differs in this way. I don't know how specifically it differs, but there are words in the poem that are actually still used in that area even today, which Tolkien doesn't mention.
I definitely noticed like bray was one of them that really stuck out to me. I was like, that's definitely a very Scottish, esque, certainly northern UK.
Yeah, there's other what was the word, barley or something like that. It apparently still gets used in like children's playgrounds when they're, I don't know, counting off or something like that. I think I'm half remembering something I read, so don't cite me as a source on that. But yeah, the regionalism of the poem is really interesting to me, actually. You can trace Gawain's journey from wherever Camelot is presumed to be up north. Like there's real locations mentioned. I actually love the part where he's traveling because the poet is just like, so he leaves. He does a bunch of stuff. He fights a ton of monsters, you guys, but we don't care about that right now.
We don't have time for all that.
Yeah, although he has time right before that to describe Gawain's armor in excruciating detail.
Great detail. And for me, that is sort of the Frenchiness of it. Like that and the chivalry, the chivalric concerns with the kissing and the I cannot, the preoccupation with courtly love and treatment of women. That's what feels so Frenchy about it. Even though you're right, the fairy part of it is very British in the deepest roots of that.
Yeah. Oh, that brings up the poem is a lot of the elements of it do show up in other or earlier works. Like the beheading thing shows up. The sort of repetition of three elements thing that happens is very like old fairy tale. But yeah, the Frenchiness is the way that it turns into, instead of like you're playing for your life or whatever, it's the way it would be in maybe some older fairy tales. It's like you're just kissing a pretty lady in the room.
And you're real torn up about it. Just
not that torn up though. I love...
kind of torn up.
I love the way she gets him to do anything, which is like, I know you're not Gawain, because the real Gawain
Yes.
would be sexing me up right now. The real Gawain would be so honorable that he would do whatever I, a woman, request.
Which is hilarious because it makes you wonder if Gawain's also partially thinking, wait, my reputation hasn't preceded me. What's wrong here?
Very specific elements of my reputation have preceded me. The one where I'll just do whatever.
Something that's interesting in that regard, that French elements, is the fact, and again, turning back to the introduction, how, and it should be noted, the introduction, as Christopher Tolkien says, is his overall introduction to the entire text, which everything was presented after he passed. That Tolkien had worked on these, and there was the BBC radio reading of his translation in 53, before Lord of the Rings was published. This would have been just simply as a very interesting scholarly thing. And Tolkien's introductions as such are simply notes and drafts that were never formally completed. Having said that, Tolkien in this overall introduction does talk about how, making note of the fact that that whoever the poet is, however often the West Midlands, is well aware of French customs, thoughts, etc., things like this. He specifically brings that up as sort of distinguishing, not necessarily English element. It's the idea, sort of yes, he's drawing that in. And he also spends time talking about, you could call it the Christian overlay of the entire thing, but unsurprisingly, I think, Tolkien really sort of focuses in on this precisely because, dare I say, he would. This is, the author is a Catholic author, because this is very much, over 100 years before the Reformation. And so these elements would very much stand out to him, and similar things that other research that and work that he did in poetic forms and things that he adapted. I'm not too surprised about Invocations of Mary and things like that being something that he would, that would resonate, I guess is the best way to put it. So,
although that is one element that stood out to me as feeling as almost like it was just kind of a gloss of Christendom overall. It's, you get the trappings, and people are constantly going to mass and whatnot, but it's it's not necessarily intrinsic to, like, Gawain's moral code does not explicitly come from God and mass and the Bible. It's rather because of knightlyhood, which, yes, is connected to God, because everything was connected to God and, well, the church, really. But it feels more like went to mass, God be with you, etc., etc. Like, it's just a thing that you do and say. It's not really like...
The thing that sort of leaps out in terms of this gloss, and that leapt out to me in rereading the story, and again, to just say that I'm familiar with the story, but it'd been a long time since I'd read at least this particular version of it, is when the Green Chapel itself is encountered, it is not a chapel as we understand it. It is all of a sudden, we have, you're right, Oriana, the sense of, a glossing, but sort of a familiar thing. And then all of a sudden this eruption of something completely pagan. Is the best way to put it. It's like, how could it even be called a chapel? That's very interesting.
The chapel is 100% a Neolithic barrow tumulus, shaft tomb, like Newgrange, or like I'm spacing on the others, but it's a very common thing in the British Isles, is this like mound, and there's a shaft down the middle, and there's like carvings on the wall, and it's all overgrown and ruined now. But like, when I read that part the first time coming to this poem as an adult, I got to that and I was like, oh my God.
Right, yeah.
Really? That's what the chapel is? Oh, wow. And I nerded out over it for too long, but
the fact that and the fact that the Gawain clearly is surprised too. This is beyond his expectation. This is the last thing he expected to see. Do you have the lines there, Oriana? Maybe or
then he halted and held in his horse for the time, and changed off his front the chapel to find. Such on no side he saw, as seemed to him strange, save a mound as it might be near the marge of a green, a worn barrow on a brae by the brink of a water. Beside falls in a flood that was flowing down. The burn bubbled therein as if boiling it were. I think that's, it had a hole at the end, or then he went to the barrow and about it he walked, debating in his mind what might the thing be. It had a hole at the end and at either side, and with grass and green patches was grown all over. and was all hollow within, not but an old cavern, or a cleft in an old crag. He could not name it aright.
Yeah. That's definitely what I was thinking of.
That in particular, that passage, like all of the very Scottish, Welsh, Breton-y language that's in there, burn, bray, that sort of language, it tips you off. It's actually, and reading it out loud is so much better. I should have like found an audio version of this to listen to, because it really, like when you're reading it, when I was reading it, I found it kind of dry, but as soon as I was saying it out loud, it kind of took on a life.
This is such a freewheeling discussion.
Yes.
That reminds me of specific choices that he made in translation. This was not the first translation I read. I mentioned, I think on the last episode, that when I first picked up this book, when I first got into Tolkien years ago now, I thought it was going to be more Middle-earth stuff. Opened it, was like, no, this is not Middle-earth. I don't care. Put it down. Mm-hmm. So the first translation I read was Bernard O'Donoghue's, and then the second translation I read was Simon Armitage's, and then this one is the third one I read. The other two don't do what Tolkien does, which is try to preserve as much of the alliteration as possible. I will say, just to be honest, I don't like Tolkien's translation as much as Simon Armitage's.
Okay.
But Simon Armitage doesn't give you the same feeling that Tolkien's does, which is this very old alliterative English verse, which is how all English verse used to be.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know as much about the history of poetry as I should, but I believe that French poetry is more like Gawain, where there's like meter and syllable counts and that kind of thing. And then older English poetry does have rhythm and meter, but it's less important than how much alliteration you can fit into something. Like if you read Beowulf, it's like every single line is like that. And this is sort of Beowulfian in some ways, just Frenchified. So yeah, when reading this one out loud, I'm sure is much more satisfying because it's got that sound repetition. It's probably not, I don't want to say it's not as accurate a translation because I am not qualified to make that judgment. But he's going for a very different effect than other people. Other people are like, well, how can I make this sound poetic now? And Tolkien is just like, screw what you guys think in 1950.
But maybe on that point, what makes the Armitage translation better for you as a reader, at least, and then the Tolkien's? Where do you see Tolkien falls down in that regard?
I don't know if I would say Tolkien's is worse necessarily, but he's not putting in the work to make it flow for a modern reader.
Okay.
It is very scholarly, which is fine. But if you just want to read a poem and not get tripped up on maybe older usages that are unfamiliar to you, or to modern ears, sometimes alliteration can just sound sort of childish and storybook-like. Armitage avoids that. I hate to use the word accessible in this context because it almost makes it sound like he's kind of dumbing it down, and Armitage is not doing that. But it does flow better in modern English, and Tolkien's, again, he's not translating so much as just like changing a few words so you can understand it in the 20th century. So it's it almost feels like less of a translation and more just like, okay, fine, I'll let you look at it.
It does, the scholarliness, I think that kind of, for me, was why it felt a little dry. It's sort of like, how you cook a turkey. Like, there are different ways of doing it, and none of them are necessarily wrong. But if you do it one way, it ends up a little dry. If you brine it for a while before cooking it, I'm losing control of this metaphor.
No, I get it. I get where you're going for. And it is, they have different goals for sure. I think they achieve their different goals. But for enjoyment for me, for reading, Tolkien is maybe second to the Simon Armitage one. I'm sorry, John. Sorry. I love you, but
not everything can be what it is. So
right.
Here's something to throw in on. There are a couple of points there that you brought up. I think I want to go back on, but let me throw in another thought contextually that may explain or may shed a particular light on this poem and how, as you were saying, Jared, the idea of whether or not there was any sort of direct influence of any sort in his own creative work. Interestingly enough, as I was reading it, the author I was thinking of, a 20th century fantasy author that would respond to the subject matter, I think, more thoroughly than Tolkien necessarily, even though I'm clear Tolkien obviously knew the poem well, is E.R. Edison.
Ooh, yeah.
Because for those who, if you've not read Edison, Edison is his own kettle of fish. To briefly explain, Edison is kind of like Tolkien's warped mirror image in terms of certain obsessions, is the best way to put it. An English civil servant, if I remember correctly. Again, most of his published work came for, I think The Hobbit was the only thing that was published by Tolkien before Edison himself died, and Edison's work was mostly published in the 20s and 30s. His fantasies, for all told, along with the translation of Icelandic saga, again, there's a weird sort of connection in terms of Tolkien's interest there, are very much sort of, big, elaborate, strange, otherworldly, very, very unusual, and very interesting fantasies. They are, however, very, very different from Tolkien in a big way. Tolkien's ultimate humanism is, you could say, love for the little people. Not evident in Edison. If anything, I don't know if I remember, Tolkien said it himself, but other people did, that there was thoughts of going like, yeah, some of what Edison's doing here is kind of Nietzschean in a bad way, and again, think 20s and 30s.
It's a little bit Ayn Rand does high fantasy.
Yeah, that's a very,
but
keep it in mind.
So here's the thing. They are beautiful books. They just have this repellent core.
And why I bring this up is that much of what we see in terms of the subject of this poem is very Edison-like. The worm Ouroboros, once you get through its crazy framing thing at the beginning, once it gets into, the actual story, is very similar to this. You have essentially, a king and all his equals and all that, and everyone's very, very happy for being martial and glorious and good and all the whole thing. It's very much the vibe. And then someone comes in to disrupt it, provide a new challenge. And hey, that's great. And even though this is just a story of one knight going through a thing, arguably it's like, Edison takes this idea and runs with it in 8 million different directions within this. And also, unlike Tolkien, trust me, Edison deals with sex. So, which this poem very much deals with too. So
yes, this is the sexiest thing Tolkien's ever been involved in.
Very, very true. At least directly. And he didn't write it. He was translating someone else, which may explain the dryness. I better stop there. But seeing that is interesting. I was reading it, going like, yeah, this is not a Tolkien-esque story as we would know it. It's. I don't want to say it's an Edison-like story. It is its own story. And the other thing that sort of came to mind, especially as you were just reading it there, around, is we have this written poem rather. Was it originally oral? Was it originally something read out and then written down? It was sort of like, we don't know. There's no way of knowing as far as I know. I mean, there could be more scholarship on this matter. And again, as Jared indicated, there have been other versions of this floating around. But that would be very interesting to figure out how this particular construction of a piece came together. So anyway, more thoughts later, but just throwing those things out for now.
This is my non-medieval scholar self talking. But to me, if it was originally oral at all, I feel like there's very little of that remaining, because this poem is so intricately structured in a way that is different from oral poetry. If you look at much older things like the Odyssey or Beowulf even, they have a very focused attention span. It's one thing at a time. They may occasionally loop back for flashbacks. They may nest stories within stories. But what this poem does, which is part of what makes it so interesting to me, is it's almost cinematic. It cuts between different things that are happening simultaneously in a way that I'm not sure oral poetry tends to do, which is actually when I remember reading that part during, it's the 3 days that Gawain is at the castle being seduced by the lady while the guy's out hunting. They intercut Gawain being tempted with the violent death of animals, which is so weird and interesting to me because it's pretty graphic. It goes into like pretty technical detail about butchering deer.
It's almost like a how-to guide to butcher various, which is one thing that, and there is some repetition though in the 3 days, like in the structure of like, you know, what time the guy gets up to go hunting and that sort of thing. And I think that those might be relics of a much earlier version of this story that maybe was oral. But I think you're right about the structure being maybe a little too intricate. The word intricate is very intricate. So I think you're right. But there are these weird things that seem like tells.
Yeah. To me, it has the feeling of a reworking of much older material with some courtly love stuff
smushed in. Yeah, I wonder if there was a version of this that didn't quite have the courtly love like subplot or theme, that was just, you know, Gawain flies off the handle and cuts this guy's head off. Like, even though the smart thing would have been to just give him a tap or something and then hope that he does the same to you. I wonder if there was some earlier version of this.
Well, when it comes to Arthurian stuff, it's always difficult to talk about what an original version is because so much of it is actually French.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's some like very old Welsh material happening here in Arthurian stuff in general, not in Gawain necessarily. But so much of what we think is Arthurian is really just medieval stuff that some French dudes were like, hey, I want to write about some fairies.
Yeah.
It's interesting to bringing up the question of, you know, Arthur itself, and, you know, Tolkien having said more than once about, you know, sort of like, these French stories and all that, is that of course Tolkien did try to do a Arthurian poem. That's one of the posthumous things that Christopher Tolkien edited and put out over the past couple of decades, The Fall of Arthur, which was a poem he worked on, if I remember right, back in the 30s. And there's no space to really go into it for here, and it's been a while since I've read it, so I don't want to make any grand claims about it. But it is interesting tonally how very different that is. There are certainly elements of it. He is working from particular sources, but he's very much putting his own spin on it in interesting ways. He doesn't complete it. It's very much an abandoned effort, so it's more sort of like the gearing up to what's going on, but there's more dramatic movements of armies and things like that initially, as opposed to this much more focused story. And there's less, at least that I remember, more about the courtly love maneuvering, so much as there is more about Lancelot and Guinevere, and more like moving towards a higher tragedy, you could say. So that's kind of an interesting sort of difference, you could say, in scale between Tolkien's own attempt of the material and working with someone else's. So that might be sort of something to tease out. But again, it's been a while. I can't say more on that front.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Arthurian thing, I mean, we're kind of coming back to one of the original points being that he wanted to create an alternative to Arthur, in a sense, with his work, to create a mythology for England that was English, and Arthur is Welsh and French. So Gawain is Welsh and French, obviously. It's very, very French. But it's again that kind of that pushing away, that like, not this is fine if you're French, but we're English.
Yeah.
So we're going to do something a little different here. So that's why I feel like he ends up back at like Beowulf and other more Nordic things.
The thing that sort of strikes me too about this is getting back to I don't want to say the identity of the poet, but it might be useful to keep in mind the point raised accurately about the sheer detail of the hunt and then the prepping up of all the animals they get and all that. It's almost documentary like to a degree.
Yes.
You get a sense that whoever this poet is had done that, you know, and probably and almost certainly was a particular social class, let's say rather elevated. I mean, in terms of characters, you have about, 5-6 key characters throughout the whole thing, and otherwise you have a nameless rabble of servants and assistants and everything like that. So, that's a focus there too. And in that regard, at least in this particular version of it, you get a sense of, somebody who you can almost sort of sense the outlines, you could say, of whoever wrote this and who they were.
Mhm.
And again, why maybe Tolkien sort of had a particular interest in the poem for possibly the poet, someone who could say was, landed gentry, let's say, anonymous regardless, not maybe any sort of high, well-known nobleman, but somebody who sort of like, kind of knew what was around and did things, because this is the way we've always done it. And that's the other thing too. I mean, when you think about how, fox hunting and all that is still a thing that's been a debate in my lifetime in the UK, and you think about all the hundreds and hundreds of years of all that's going on, and just like you're reading about things like, oh, and they send the beaters out to stir up the things, and I'm like, that's right. They don't really hunt. They get their little minions to go chase all the things so they can go get them without having to do much. It's like, which, is not the case in this poem. The idea is the Lord of the Castle is, Bertilac is supposed to is shown as being out there as actually doing stuff, but still, so it's a portrayal of mindset is what it is. I mean, as much as the details of the feast, and that is interesting. The masses are mentioned in 2 lines. The feasts are not. The feasts are very detailed. It's sort of like, what do you really like? It ain't praying.
It does feel that was a thing that Tookman's A Distant Mirror was very helpful for me to, she describes how most of the stories that we have, everything that's been written down from that time period is aspirational. Chivalry was aspirational because it never ever actually happened. Like no one ever actually behaved the way they were supposed to behave. And so having just seen all of the ways in which chivalry was BS in the 14th century, it was really interesting to read this as, frankly, aspirational. This is purely, someone going, this is how you should do things, which I guess is kind of, in that sense, the wiki how of butchering deer and boar. I'm going to keep this handy for the apocalypse, honestly. It'll be very helpful for that. It does kind of mesh with this is how you should be of it all.
Like he's very hands-on in terms of the violence, and then he comes home and he's like the perfect host.
Yeah.
Up to and including "Take my wife, please."
Right.
And
well, let's delve into the reaction. I mean, the fact that, as you said there, Jared, the fact that, the key thing that turns on it is that Gawain gives his host the kisses. It's interesting, I think, to delve into how the host reacts to those kisses.
He's just like, okay.
He's like, cool.
Where'd that come from? Like, cool. Where'd you get that? And he's like, well, I can't. That's not part of the bargain. I'm not going to tell you. It's very flirty.
Feels
like it's preserving his own skin, but it's also like, I'm not going to tell.
It feels very like there's a queer veneer.
There is a vibe.
But is it us reading back that vibe, or is it just
probably.
Is homosexuality different? I mean, this is what do we know, I guess, is the question.
Well, so I don't know a lot about this. I wish I knew more. But from other things that I've read that are either medieval or people riffing off of medieval stuff, it's just like, they kissed in greeting, and it's fine. The third night, the Lord of the Castle, Lord Bertilac, gets home. Gawain gets all dressed up. He was clad in a blue cloak that came to the ground. His surcoat well beseemed him with its soft lining and its hood of like hue that hung on his shoulder, all fringed with white fur, very finely rebothed. That's another thing I love about the poem, is it's just like, you know what, let's take several lines to describe your clothes. And then it goes on, He met indeed the master in the midst of the floor, and in gaiety greeted him, and graciously said, in this case I will first our covenant fulfill, that to our good we agreed, when ungrudged went the drink. He clasps then the knight and kisses him thrice, as long and deliciously as he could lay them upon him. By Christ, the other quoth, you've come by a fortune in winning such wares. Were they worth what you paid? And that's,
I mean,
how that goes. It's weird because, like, again, other stuff is just like they kissed, like it's no big deal, like that's how you greet each other in the Middle Ages, whatever. It's how you greet each other in France now. It's just like, mwah, that's it. And this is like, no, let's do it long and deliciously.
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 I mean,
it would be interesting to see if that was essentially the word and Tolkien just simply adapted it, or if it was something else. I mean,
well, I think Armitage translates that part as just like sweetly, which fine, and then later says, like, I think just a few lines later, Bertolac like gives a Yelp review of this and is like, "Oh, it was delicious," which happens in Tolkien too. It's just a different word, but it's so weird. It doesn't mesh with anything else. Even like the bedroom scenes with the lady, like the third third morning, she's
basically like just wearing just like a bit of a robe and apparently almost nothing else.
Yeah,
like, hello.
Which, you know, what does this mean in medieval terms? If you're like stripped to your underwear, is it just like a shift? Like, what's happening? She gets all dressed down, as it were, and comes into Gawain's room and is like, hey. Even then, Gawain is like, no, I don't think so. I don't know about that. And the way that he reacts to her is much more like teasing and not flirtatious exactly, but like avoiding, retreating, getting away from.
Yeah.
And then he's like, okay, I'll kiss you. Yes, let's do this part. But then he gets all dressed up fancy and goes to, it is weird. And I would love to see some scholarship devoted entirely to what the hell's going on here.
Mm-hmm. And it may well be, you know, floating around and we just don't know about it. But yeah. You're right. I mean, it is a tangled thing. You know, it's something, too, to note, though, as well, is that, Gawain's reaction almost seems like a splittering, oh, lady, Mrs. Lady, but, you know, in you know, that type of thing. But in reality, he is, it's more, that's more the subtext you're getting for. It's like, oh, geez, and, you know, but he's speaking well throughout. He's not just simply going like, duh, you know, the poet doesn't have him just say like, or anything like that. He's basically parrying every blow, going like, okay. And he's allowing for some interiority with Gawain, which makes sense, which we don't get with any of the characters, which again, makes sense, you know, that's...
I don't want to give the impression that he's like, oh, I'm not going to talk to you, lady. They do talk for long passages, but it is just talking,
right? And
it is him refusing and her offering.
Rather thoroughly.
I kind of, how do we feel about her?
I was about to ask,
because to me, there's a little later on in the poem where the poet is just like, oh yeah, you know what? Everything that sucks is probably women's fault.
Yes. Yeah, they're drawing all these historical, legendary examples and things like that. Kind of garbage. So
yeah, I don't love that part. But it's, I don't know. She's, this is again a spoiler, like everything else has been. She's been asked to do this by her husband.
Yeah,
they are testing Gawain's honor, so she doesn't have a lot of agency in this, but she also really gets into it.
Yeah,
she's here for it.
Good. Is she like a good actress? Is the Lord maybe like not attending to her needs properly? And she was like, oh, here's an opportunity. Like,
yeah, like, oh, I'll flirt with him. You want me to flirt with him? Okay. Oh no, what a hardship. No, I'll definitely, oh God, yeah. Well, you know, Gawain is described in great detail earlier in the poem. It's like, oh, his muscular calves and all that. So, you know, she is a character, but she doesn't have. She's a tool.
Yeah, it's very men writing women subreddit material.
Oh well, you want that? I mean, I think the perfect example of that is this is in part 2 when he's meeting everybody, having come to the castle, and he meets her, and then he meets who you later find out is apparently Morgan Le Fay in disguise. But that description, I mean, I've got it right here, so here we go. Apologies, everyone. This is pretty bad, and I can't. It may be in translation, but I can't imagine the original poem was any much different. So,
right.
Let's see. So talking about the lady of the castle's assistant, who is an older woman who it turns out is Morgan Le Fay in disguise, conceiving all this. Her 2 eyes and her nose and her naked lips, and those were hideous to behold and horribly bleared. That a worthy dame she was may well, for God be said. Short body and thick waist, with bulging buttocks spread, more delicious to the taste was the one by her led. It's like, thanks guy.
Morgan is also, so we're talking about the treatment of women here. It's interesting that, so everything that happens in the poem, all of the hunting and the kissing and the chapels and all that, is just because Morgan Le Fay wanted to frighten Guinevere to death. That's it. That's the, like,
wild.
That's why it's so weird. It's like, why couldn't it just be like a weird knight who just wants to mess with people? Why do you have to?
Why, like, the head could have just been off already. I have some notes on this plan.
Yes, tell us.
Yes.
Morgan Le Fay. No, it's truly like, it takes a second for that to really sink in too, because it comes right at the very end. It's like, oh, and by the way, like the previous 90 pages of this, like, were just
Morgan screwing.
it's just this one lady who hates you. And it's interesting, like, if you don't know the Arthurian legends very well, that must be so confused. Like, if all you really know is like, oh, Morgan Le Fay is like, she's bad, this doesn't really track very well. You have to, like, you can't remove this from the overall context of the Arthurian legends. I don't know, was that an issue for the people reading or hearing this? Like,
I don't think medieval people are super big on plot structure and like tight plotting.
It's like, oh no, that's she's just there and she hates Guinevere and it's bad.
Yeah, like that's all you need to know. It's bad. I don't know.
And it sort of speaks to the stock framing or that's around it. I mean, in the same way we talk about the the Christian gloss, we could even just legit say the Arthurian gloss is essentially is pretty much the beginning and the end.
That's
and
true.
In between is a story that if you had it by any other name, you're just sort of like, okay, and just think things are happening and going along here. So I will sort of end my contribution to the discussion, but Jared should end out by just pointing out that there are 2 adaptations that I know of, film-wise. There are probably more. One of which has not been released yet. We talked about it last time. That is
so excited.
The Dev Patel Green Knight one, which, having reread this again, I'm like, boy, the riff they're doing in that one, because that's an A24 production, and it looks like, oh yeah, medieval folk horror, bring it.
Yeah, it looks glorious.
Yes, and having Dev Patel as Gawain, yeah, why wouldn't the Lady of the Castle throw her? So,
right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of solves itself. But
she didn't have to be asked twice.
Right?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what they take of the framing of this, what they take of the story, and actually adapt it, because it definitely doesn't feel like it's the same thing. So it's a question of what they'll do with it. Now, the other one, which I think I mentioned, and this thing, this is 1984's Sword of the Valiant, starring Miles O'Keefe, one of the many late early 80s Schwarzenegger ripoffs who appeared in things like Ator the Fighting Eagle and other such Conan wannabes. He plays Gawain in this one, and it's Sean Connery as the Green Knight. This is a bad film. This is a very bad film. It has bits of the framing of the story, but believe me, it is not the story. I mean, they're just, sure, watch it. Watch it for 1984 generic, terrible ripoff of all sorts of fantasy tropes with not really great budgets and very, very hammy acting. It's a crazy cast. You've got Peter Cushing's in it, Trevor Howard, Ron Lacey, John Rhys Davies, hey, and all that. So, we got all sorts of characters in it. So it's worth seeing to make you go like, and just realize just how bad movie fantasy can get, especially of a time and place. It screams 1984. So there's that. So I'll stop there. So anyone else want to throw in on other things?
I only read the introduction once and was like, it was kind of late at night, I think. So it like a couple points or a few points in my copy, it says Gawain.
Yeah.
What?
So the poem is really inconsistent about spelling his name.
Okay, all right.
So some translations will preserve Gawain throughout.
Okay.
Tolkien uses Gawain when the poet does.
Okay.
So
I'll aboard the Gawain.
It seems, I think that the justification, both on from Tolkien's own mouth and just people in general thinking this, is that if you need to alliterate something, you use G versus W, and that's
fine.
I don't know.
No, yeah.
Take it up with the poet. I don't know.
I will.
I don't know that I have any concluding thoughts about Gawain specifically itself at the moment, but I do want to ask, did either of you go on to read Pearl and Sir Ophion? Pearl is in my volume. I don't know if it's in Oriana's.
It is.
All three are in our volumes. Yeah, I haven't had a chance. I've read them before, but it's been a very long time since I have. So did you go ahead and read them, Oriana?
I did. I hadn't read Pearl before. But
you hadn't? Yeah, that's very... I recall it being a very, very moving and strange poem. So
it's so weird.
Yeah.
Is that the one where the kid, it's like it's his
dead daughter.
Yeah.
Some people think. it's this weird like theological dream piece, and I think I don't know, that kind of comments on Gawain in interesting ways, actually, especially in Tolkien's translation, because it's very intricately structured, like Gawain is, and it's the pearl of the title is this idealized woman who's actually his dead daughter, who illustrates certain moral principles, while the women in Gawain are more like the opposite of that. But there's this interesting, and to me it feels very Catholic, focus on women as the source of either virtue or vice. Which I think actually, let's tie it back into Gawain for a second. Courtly love is very like that. Like, you idealize this woman, but she must remain untouched.
Yes.
And that is where Gawain proves his true knighthood, is in not quite touching.
Does this bug you? I'm not touching you.
Yeah. And the poem treats his only real source of shame is that he lies about one gift that she gives him, which is this green girdle that protects him from being killed.
Yeah.
Allegedly.
And, I have to say, just throwing in, I do love the detail that when it comes out is that both Bertilak and Arthur basically the same thing, like, yeah, I understand why you did, that's fine.
Yeah, his whole thing is being extremely extra about everything. So he's like, oh, wear this girdle forever as a sign of the shameful deed I did when I didn't tell this guy about this gift that his wife gave me to protect me from dying, which is somehow horrible. And then Arthur and Bertilak are just like, no, dude, it's fine. You can keep it. Like, whatever.
We'll turn it into a fashion statement for you.
Yeah. When he gets back to Camelot, Arthur's like, we're all going to wear them.
And it ends with the slogan of the Order of the Garter. I mean, the whole thing might almost be like,
it's an origin story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Garter beginnings.
Yeah. At the end of the poem, he gets recruited into the Garter.
Maybe there's no other way to end it. It explains the fashion thing. It was all about fashion. It was all about what you were.
Son, this is why we wear green scarves. Because 500 years ago, some knight kissed a dude 3 times and then lied about his belt.
I love this world.
I genuinely love this poem.
Okay, so it's now time to look ahead to the next episode. The choice of topic has come back to me. And since Oriana opened the door with the previous episode about adaptations, time to maybe start looking into one. And so it's time to start looking into maybe famous ones. I'm the one that we, just talked about, and multinational production, people from all over involved with it. It is something that was aimed for big, was staged thousands of miles away, planned together many, many miles away from where Tolkien actually was. And it's not the films. It's time to talk about The Lord of the Rings, the stage musical.
Oh, great.
Because I want to know more about this, because this was something really weird, huge, and yet obscure at the same time. What was the deal with this thing?
Have you listened to anything by the Finnish band responsible for some of it?
I've heard Vartina, but I've not heard Vartina's songs for this.
I love them. I don't love the musical, but...
But the songs are good? But Vartina's good?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, no, I recall hearing something by them. So, and then there was the composer, and then there's everything else. But
A.R. Rahman.
Yeah, thank you. But yeah, no, I kind of want to know more about this. This is an excuse to sort of delve into this, because I remember the talk about it at the time, and I remember seeing, okay, so they staged in Toronto, and then they were going to the UK, and then it died on the Vine. I mean, what was the deal with this thing? So I kind of want to know more about it and see how it worked. Now it did. And even if there's any video from it, I assume there's some.
There is.
I hope there is.
A few years after it died, I did look into it and be like, is there any of this around? And I did find a little bit, and I was just like, okay. But yeah, I'm excited for this, because this will shock everybody within the sound of my voice, but I love musicals.
Hell yeah.
And I love Lord of the Rings. So
And yeah, let me be clear. I'm going to make this clear at the start of my thing when I start next time. Once you get over a musical, one makes perfect sense. Two, there are many good reasons why it should be done as a musical, frankly. So, but we will get to that. So that'll be the thing for next time. And in July, as we move along, so we will quickly reiterate the message we started this episode with. We hope everyone stays well, safe, and on the right correct cause of things and all that, and if you're just not one of those people, why are you listening to us? Go away.
Yeah, we don't want your plays if you don't think that Black Lives Matter, Black trans lives matter,
Black disabled lives matter. They all do, and simple as that. So, but we will wrap up from here. So until next time, in a month's time, we'll see you then. Thanks for listening. Thanks again for listening to this episode of By-The-Bywater. Please subscribe and rate us via your favorite podcast listening options.
Episodes and show notes are at megaphonic.fm/bythebywater, all one word. You can also message us through here. Email us at bythebywater@megaphonic.fm or follow us on Twitter at By-The-Bywater.
You can also follow us individually on Twitter and ask questions there. I'm at Vandroid Helsing.
I'm at Schwinter, SCHWINDTER.
And I'm Ned Raggett, 2 G's, 2 T's. By-The-Bywater is a proud member of Megaphonic Podcast Network. Find all our fancy little shows at megaphonic.fm. We hope you join us again next time. Until then, Namarie.